So I want to talk about John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill, his dates are 1806 to 1873. And ethics, he published Utilitarianism in 1863. Utilitarianism in 1863. So I'm just going to kind of skim over some of these parts. But at the very top here, you got the principal ideas advanced. So what were the principal ideas that were advanced in John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism? The main thing about utilitarianism, what I can remember, is that just you take care of, the greatest majority, the supermajority. You do what's best for the lot of the people. So here we go. Those acts are right and good, which produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of persons. Perfect. Those acts are right and good, which produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of persons. So I guess a person who goes around and passes out cheeseburgers for free, everybody they meet they're making them happy. An act derives its moral worth not from its form but from its utility, although it is the intrinsic worth of pleasure, which gives value to acts conducive to pleasure. Some pleasures are better than others in quality. The proof of the value of pleasure is that it is desired, and the proof of the claim that some pleasures are better than others is that experienced, rational men prefer some pleasures to others. Justice is the appropriate name for certain social utilities by which the general good is realized. So the central aim of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism is to defend the view that those acts are right and good which produce the greatest happiness in the greatest number. This ethical position didn't originate with John Stuart Mill. An influential predecessor, Jeremy Bentham, earlier championed pleasure and pain as the sole criteria for judging what is good and bad. The utility yardstick measures good by asking, does an act increase pleasure and does it decrease pain? Does it increase pleasure and decrease pain? Bentham's crude push pin as good as poetry interpretation. So now that we have a new day here, DA, District Attorney here in the San Luis Valley, the SLV, I would like for the DA to try to be as utilitarian as possible to try to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of persons. You could always side with the 100, or you could side with the 46,000. You could side with the 1%, or you could side with the 99%. You could hobnob with the rich and powerful and large landowning aristocracy, the plutocrats, and probably get away with ignoring all the rest of us. Up to a point. Hey! Mill rejects the argument that utilitarianism chooses to picture human nature at the lowest animal level. Clearly, animals are incapable. The fact that men tacitly employ the utility yardstick is not the same as a proof of its validity. A summary statement of important criticisms of the utilitarian doctrine, along with the brief descriptions of Mill's replies, is here in order. Conscience makes up the internal sanction of the principle. Mill defines conscience as a pain more or less intense attendant on violation of duty. This sanction is really a feeling in the mind such that any violation of it results in discomfort. Even the man who thinks moral obligation has roots in a transcendental sphere acts only conscientiously in so far as he harbors religious feelings about duty. The concluding chapter of utilitarianism discusses the relation of justice to utility. The idea of justice tends to impede the victory of the utilitarian doctrine, according to Mill. Men's sentiment of justice seems to suggest existence of a natural, objective norm which is totally divorced from expediency and hedonistic consequences. John Stuart Mill's task was to indicate how the utilitarian doctrine could accommodate this sentiment and nevertheless remain the sole acceptable standard for judging right and wrong. One must examine objects in the concrete if he wants to discover whatever common features they may contain. This is true of the idea of justice. Several fundamental beliefs are associated in popular opinion with notions like just and unjust. Justice involves respect for the legal and moral rights of other people. It implies the wrongfulness of taking away another's moral rights by illegal or even legal means. There can be bad laws. The notion of desert is also important. This notion entails belief that wrongdoing deserves punishment and the doing of right reciprocation in good acts. Justice cannot mean doing good in return for evil, according to Mill. Nevertheless, men may waive justice when they are wronged. Furthermore, men ought not to break promises which are willingly and knowingly made. This is so even in the case of implied promises. Justice precludes breach of faith. Justice precludes breach of faith.
Hey!
Justice cannot mean doing good in return for evil, according to Mill. Nevertheless, men may waive justice when they are wrong. Furthermore, men ought not to break promises which are willingly and knowingly made. This is so even in the case of implied promises. Justice precludes breach of faith. Justice precludes breach of faith. Finally, justice implies impartiality and equality in the treatment of men and claims. This means that men ought to be influenced by the considerations which it is supposed ought to influence the particular case in hand. Mill concludes that several general features rather than one are common to these opinions about justice. Turning to the etymology of the word, he asserts that the primitive meaning of justice is conformity to law. The Greeks and Romans, recognizing the possibility of bad laws, came to view injustice as the breaking of those laws which ought to be obeyed. The idea of justice in personal conduct also involves a belief that a man ought to be forced to do just acts. To say that justice accepts the idea of the desirability of compelling someone to do his duty tells men what justice is about, yet it does not mark off the peculiar nature of justice from other branches of morality. According to Mill, justice involves a notion of perfect obligation. Duties of perfect obligation imply the existence of a correlative right in a person or persons. Justice implies something which it is not only right to do and wrong not to do, but which some individual person can claim from me as his moral right. This view of justice admits a distinction between moral obligation and the domains of beneficence and generosity. In men, the sentiment of justice becomes moralized, spread over a social group or community. Justice then involves a feeling that one ought to punish those who harm members of that community. Men's need of security plays a role here. The idea of right does also. Justice involves a belief that there are rights which morally society must defend. Thus, justice is compatible with the utility principle, for when moralized by the social feeling, it only acts in directions and conformable to the general good. The idea of justice requires belief in a rule of conduct applicable to all men, plus a sentiment which sanctions the rule. This sentiment, which insists transgressors be punished, is compatible with the utility principle if the idea of justice is taken to refer to special classes of moral rules. These are the rules without which the realization of the general good would be impossible. An important example of such rules would be those forbidding one person to harm another. Such rules presuppose the utilitarian doctrine that one person's happiness must be considered as important as another's. Mill's conclusion is that justice remains the appropriate name for certain social utilities, which are vastly more important and therefore more absolute and imperative than any others are as a class. Utilitarianism is a book of significance for thinkers concerned about the problem of moral fairness in a social setting. Mill attempted to show that men's notions of obligation can be made compatible with the utility principle. What animates the work is Mill's clear conviction that even the more exalted moral claims of intuitionists and Kantian moralists make sense only if the utilitarian doctrine is the true one. Only with justice and binding rules of obligation can man achieve the greatest happiness of the greatest number.